Hello and welcome to this talk on adapting UIs for mobile touch. My name is Ambrose Little. I'm a principal design technologist here at Infragistics. We make lots of UI design and developer tools as well as some enterprise mobility solutions. Today we'll be talking about this topic. First picture you're seeing here is the dream. It's the one ring. That's what all developers want. They want to write the ultimate program that will solve all possible cases and usages and contexts and things like that. But the reality is, even for mobile, this can't be the case. The problem with mobile in particular, especially if you're starting from a desktop and you want to move to a mobile solution, is you often run into this problem. That's from Tommy Boy. That's him saying, "I'm a fat guy in a little coat." That's the reality, is that you're trying to stuff something that just doesn't fit into the mobile if you start from a desktop and just try to kind of squish it in there. What you have to think about is not only the literal, like the size of the screens, but also the context. Contexts may or may not differ very much in terms of what people actually want to achieve, but the context in which apps are being used is greatly different for mobile devices than it is for your average desktop or laptop. There are going to be some exceptions, but by and large that's kind of a truism. This is a nice quote from senior research scientist Rachel Inman. Applying PC context assumptions to mobile experiences all too often results in a marginalized experience for users. And that's going to be true if you take this approach of trying to fit your standard desktop design approach into the mobile environment. So today we want to talk about some of the important design considerations, talking about reducing, in and out, eye on the ball, touchy-feely, and Moore's Law. So this is kind of what we're going to cover at a high level in this talk. First of all, reduce. So here you're seeing a screenshot of AT&T's wireless account overview page, and then you see something similar here in their wireless app. Now these, were taken before you watch this, so they could definitely have changed in the meantime, but it introduces you to the concept. You can see on the left side there's a ton of things. I mean, you see 1, 2, 3, at least 4 possibly levels of navigation, all within this one page. And then you see tons and tons of links, and you see sidebars, and you see other stuff. That probably was never really a great idea from a user perspective to kind of take this approach to begin with. But it's even more crazy if you start trying to do something similar on the mobile situation. Now you can see on the mobile case, it's pretty straightforward and simple. It gives you kind of an overview of where you stand and a few top-level task or context-oriented navigations. It's very flat. Now, in terms of in and out, this is important to keep in mind for mobile apps because unlike a lot of desktop contexts, you don't have the luxury of assuming that you have their complete attention. You don't have the luxury of assuming they're going to want to spend a lot of time or that they even will spend a lot of time with your interface. So you have to think much more about how can you get the people to what they want as quickly as possible and not require them to dig through, like you saw on the last screen, a ton of navigation potentially in order to find what they need. So you really have to go back and re-examine your basic assumptions in terms of what you want to enable people to do on mobile. Now, glanceability is actually a specialized version of this, which is when you want to be able to get them the information they need at a glance, and we'll see a little bit more on that soon. Now, this example you see here is from Foursquare. And the reason I call it out here is it's kind of a subtle, but it's an effective way to kind of bring to the front what you want people to do, not so much what you want them to do, but what they would want to do with your app. So you got to think about, there's a pattern, clear entry points. What are the few things that people are definitely going to want to do, and even of those, what is maybe the most common or the most primary, and you make that the most obvious thing. And here, the subtle thing is to just make that button stand out a little bit from the taskbar and put it in the center so it's easily tappable by, whether you're holding it with your left or your right hand. Glanceability is a related thing, and that's pretty straightforward in terms of the word itself. You just have to think about what information should I surface that someone could literally just glance at the screen and know what they need to know. I mean, that doesn't work obviously for all usage scenarios, but there are quite a few, especially in the mobile context, because you end up being one of many apps on someone's device, and you want to be able to get them that quick in and out view of probably the most common thing they're going to want, so that they don't even really have to do any extra navigation. They just open it, it's there, and they can move on with life. And of course, on some platforms you can take it to another level by leveraging the integration with like notification centers and overview centers like that. So it's definitely something to think about if your target platform supports it. Here's another great example of glanceability where Microsoft really nailed it in bringing that information up onto the tiles themselves. And you can see it's more than just a badge, that has a number, which could be interpreted any number of ways. You have a lot more flexibility, and it's even grown over the years in terms of what you can do with the live tiles and the fact that they're live, so that you can push more than one interesting message or image to people, and really not even require them to go into the app to begin with, maybe to get the information that they need. So it's a really kind of a home run that they came up with there. Flat nav is another interesting concept. You won't see that kind of multifaceted, not multifaceted, but that multi-layered navigation in mobile apps usually. If you do, maybe it's not so great. But the point is that you really want to try to keep it within maybe 2 layers. If you think of it like you have your main navigation or activities, at the top level. In this case, on the iPhone, you have the little bar at the bottom, the app bar. I think on the Android it's at the top, but the point is that you have that layer and then maybe one more layer within your app to get people to doing something useful. You really don't want to go beyond that, or it just gets, a lot of friction from the user perspective. So you definitely cannot usually take a desktop navigation and just sort of like use the built-in nav in a mobile platform. You have to really rethink that and try to break it down a little bit more. Keeping your eye on the ball, this is just from a design perspective. You have to think about the fact that you're not in the PC context. Someone's not going to be sitting in the office. Maybe they are, but you don't know. They could be anywhere. And then also the fact that they could be moving. They might be driving down the road even though they're not supposed to be. Think about that. I mean, your app could be involved in an accident. So if you don't make it glanceable, and you could have, who knows, maybe you're causing an accident. So it's totally different kind of environment that you get into when you're thinking about mobile versus your stereotypical desktop design. And you really have to start thinking about the user context and what people need, and getting them to that as fast as they can, because it really can, even if your app itself is not life or death, because they could be using it anywhere, it could turn into a life or death situation. So keep that in mind. It's pretty important. The other thing about mobility is that you're switching from device to device. I mean, maybe you start out on your phone and then you decide, hey, I would rather read this on my tablet. And then maybe you're like, well, I really need to do a lot of writing or something, and you don't really want to sit there and tap on your device, and you have the option. Then you could go to a desktop. So the reason that's helpful is if you're thinking about those from a design perspective, you can help facilitate those transitions. And in fact, the upcoming iOS 8 release, they've really come up with a slick story for that, in terms of being able to start writing something like an email on your iPhone, and then literally you go to your desktop and it recognizes that you're working on that, and you can pick up right where you left off. I mean, that again is another one of those home runs from a user perspective. And the more that platform vendors and applications take advantage of these capabilities that they're coming up with, the smoother it is going to be for everyone in terms of the story of moving from device to device. So that's if you can do that, I would highly recommend it. Of course, you know, it also depends on your usage context. So if maybe you have a status update on a task that someone's working on, and then you want to be able to have them pick up that task right away on their desktop because they need to do some work in a desktop app, for instance. I mean, that's a great story of someone, you know, walking down the hall, they get a notification, it's too much of a pain or whatever to do it from the mobile. So if you can figure out a way to easily bring that up, like you tap a button, say work on this on my desktop, and then as soon as they log in or open their desktop app, you bring that case or whatever it is, that task up for them, that's pretty slick. So think about opportunities like that. And this is related to those designing for interruptions. You don't want to assume, again, that people are just sitting there focused. You've done it yourself. I'm sure you have. You're sitting there. You could be anywhere. In a coffee shop, someone walks up to you, starts talking while you're working on something. You're at home. One of your kids comes up and starts talking to you, or maybe your significant other. You know, it's just the way things are now that devices are everywhere, and it's only going to keep being more and more like this. So the reason this is important is you got to think about things like you can't just have sessions time out because of inactivity. I mean, that's not real great. So you got to think about ways to get beyond that problem. You know, if someone closes the app on their phone by hitting home or whatever, you need to save whatever current state was there. And most of the platforms provide ways to do that. So, but you need to take advantage of it and actually do it. So make sure you're doing those kinds of things, because there's nothing more frustrating to be in the middle of something on your phone or your tablet and it goes to sleep, or you switch over to something else and the app doesn't properly handle that, and you go back and you lost whatever you were working on. So you definitely need to be thinking about that and design for interruptions. Now, this is kind of a given here for most of us. It's definitely kind of the most obvious, that's why I say dot on here, change that came along with mobile devices, and especially phones, is a built-in GPS and location services. So if in any way possible that is relevant for your app, by all means be thinking about how you can take advantage of that and use it. Don't forget about this, but of course there are lots of other different possible new sensor type things that you can think about, which I'll get to some of those here in a minute. Touchy-feely, this is by far another most obvious and crucial difference between desktop and mobile. Desktop and mobile. The most common differences in terms of events, I list some of those here. There's going to be more once you get into it, you know, and you get usage and you do some usability studies. You're going to figure out which ones matter more for your particular context. But just be thinking about the fact that just like you can't bring the navigation in, you can't necessarily just bring in your existing interactions, especially hover. That's like the most common one that people seem to struggle with. So you just have to think about new ways to design your interface so that it doesn't rely on hovering, or maybe if you absolutely need that kind of extra on demand kind of interface, then you can have that go by pressing and holding or some other means. You know, maybe there's a swipe and a more or something like that. And then of course keyboarding. You don't want to be requiring typically a lot of keyboard interactions if your app involves that. You know, if that's kind of core to your domain, fine, there's not any way around that. But if you can come up with other ways to input information, smarter pickers, if you can do more domain specific pickers that get people to where they have to type as few things as possible, that's great. You know, autocomplete, if they're doing any kind of entry that does require that, where you can help them to complete what they're typing, another huge win. So just be thinking about the fact, and all the implications of the touch interfaces. So this is definitely something you have to keep in mind. You know as well as I do that your fingers are not as pointy as a mouse cursor. So you have to keep that in your head when you're moving to touch interfaces, and most mobile devices are touch interfaces, of course. So here are some general guidelines. I mean, it's always best to actually do testing and make sure that you see where and if people are messing up and hitting things incorrectly. But these are pretty good rules of thumb, and you can translate these into pixels depending on the environments. I mean the mobile device pixel densities. The reason these are in millimeters is because in human factors it's actually more relevant to talk about the actual physical measurements as opposed to pixel measurements, because they are so variable. So that's why these are this way. Now 9mm squared, that's like rather large, quite honestly. If you're used to designing for desktop and you start putting things in the equivalent pixel space of 9mm square, it's a big touch target. The thing with that is that it's optimal. So when that's really important is when you really don't want people to miss it. And so that's going to also relate to the particular task that you're asking them to do and how important it is that they don't mess up. Some other suggestions here, like 7mm high is okay. You can make it wider if that's the case. That kind of has an interesting portion that if things are wider, then that's good. And then if you do want to have like a smaller visual size, like 4.2mm as the minimum, then what you can do is actually put invisible buffer. So you would put kind of like an invisible triangle overlay or something like that, not triangle, rectangle overlay around your visual target, and that means that when people get near it, even if it's smaller, visually, they'll still be able to touch it, and that's perfectly fine. There's some guidelines there in terms of spacing. Spacing is important, especially on not just smaller, but when you have things, multiple choices that are next to each other. So if you have like a menu bar or something like that, you need to be thinking not only about the size, but also about spacing, and you want to do that, make sure that's there. So if you go smaller, for instance, than 9mm square, then you might want to start thinking about a little bit more spacing. So think about that, and as I said before, target size is proportional to the consequences of missing. Obviously, you don't want to frustrate people in general, so it's good to not make it hard. I mean, if you want an experience of what not a good way to do it is try to load up a standard, desktop interface on a device that supports touch, like a Surface tablet or something like that, and try to actually use it. And we saw this. You see this today with a lot of the desktop software. I mentioned Surface specifically because you can still run desktop software easily on it if you've got the non-RT version. So definitely you'll want to test it first of all, but these are good rules of thumb. Now here are some common gestures, the most common gestures, and they come from this nifty little resource on Luke Wroblewski's site /touch, lukew.com/touch, and he's got a nice, it's still, I mean, it's out of date, but it's still mostly relevant for especially for these generic ones like the ones listed here. You're going to want to, depending on what your target is, consult the specific guidelines for that target platform. If it's web, then you can look for some of these more kind of cross-platform commonalities, or maybe that some higher percentage of your users use Android or iOS or whatever, in which case you could kind of tilt your interface towards those platforms. And then there are some tools out there that let you do adaptive, but anytime you do stuff like that, it increases the complexity, so you really have to think about if it's worth that trade-off. Oftentimes, especially if your app is going to be used across multiple devices, potentially even by the same person, then it's better even across multiple platforms. So let's say they have an iPad, but they also have an Android phone. It would actually be better in that case to have a consistent interface for your application across the different platforms than to try to totally customize it for an individual platform. But there's a balance there, and especially if you're going to be publishing in like an app store, you are going to have to follow. Well, I should say if it's a controlled app store like a Windows or iOS, you're going to have to follow and get your stuff approved through them. So keep that in mind. But just in general, I would err towards consistency across the board, even to an extent on your actual desktop apps if you end up kind of refactoring them and making them more touch friendly, let's say. Now, another interesting thing that those of us who've been in the industry for a while have kind of gotten spoiled in the last few years is thinking about these kinds of things. I mean, obviously, most of us didn't even really have to think about battery for the most part, but these other ones, we can remember back to the earlier days when these were actually a bigger concern, and then they gradually became less and less of concern thanks to Moore's Law. But hey, guess what? It's all back again because now we've got these nice new small devices that have limited all of this stuff. So you have to actually start thinking about it again, and you have to consider the impact that your apps will have on people's devices, because if your app hogs a lot of any of these, especially battery, you're going to be in trouble with your users. Bandwidth, I would say, is probably the next most important, because the other two have a little bit more built-in management in terms of platform stuff. So, some things to think about in terms of performance. Maybe you're used to doing a lot of talky, kind of chatty interfaces between your client and your server if you are doing those kinds of apps. Or maybe you're used to doing web apps that are still more on the server side, where they generate and send down basically a whole page of new content for every interaction. Those are really kind of no-nos in the brave new world here. And it's more of a given, actually, if you're doing native, that you're not going to have that problem. But if you are doing web, it's something you definitely need to think about and be thinking about. First of all, how you can reduce the size of your payloads, and by that's just the total amount of stuff that you send over the wire. And the requests, the number of the requests that you do, that's especially important if you're on mobile networks, because of the latency that's involved in negotiating the back and forth. So there's a great presentation out there by a guy from Google. I will provide that in the notes. That goes into a lot of detail, actually, about the specifics around this, especially with cellular networks. So if you are targeting to optimize for those, there's some key things you can do, and you really do have to get the initial response down to a really rather small size. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's like 14 kilobytes. So, and that's total. You don't want to have external requests for scripts and other things like that if possible. So if you want that really more immediate responsiveness on the initial load for a website, then you got to think about stuff like that, and then you can piecemeal load in other stuff later. There's all kind of techniques for that, and there's a nifty tool called Google PageSpeed that you can use to analyze the different factors that can affect this kind of performance. Thankfully, for the web and of course for the mobile, the native platforms, there are more tools these days than there used to be to help you debug problems along these lines. So, Chrome DevTools, Firefox, IE, they all tend to have pretty decent support for figuring out where your problems are, whether it's network requests, whether it's size. Make sure you have things like zip enabled, gzip on your server as a general rule. Minimizing your scripts, making sure you're not sending down stuff that you don't need. All that stuff is important, far more so than it is when you have someone sitting on a LAN in an office. So you gotta be thinking about this stuff. The interesting note there at the end, dark themes. that's, I mean, Windows Phone 7 kind of came out of the box with that sort of thing, but the point there is that mobile devices actually, depends on the technology, but some of them use more energy if they are using lighter colors. So the dark themes were actually designed specifically to conserve some of the battery usage, and it's an interesting consideration. I wouldn't put that at the top of my optimization list, but it's something to think about. Now, earlier we were talking about the pixel densities versus the physical measurements for touch screens. Obviously there's more to it than just touch. You got to think about images too. That was a big thing when iPhone came out with their Retina display for the first time, and you get these high density, and since then more and more devices have high density displays. So you need to be thinking about this aspect both in terms of the touch, but also like images. If you have bitmaps, anything that's not vector, that will not be scaled proportionally. You'll want to consider like substituting images and stuff. I think I have a little bit more about that later on. I highly recommend just getting. You can search online and find these lists of devices and their relative points per inch, or pixels per inch, sorry. But don't get obsessed with specific screen sizes, especially if you're doing any kind of web design. Again, I'll touch on that a little bit later. Here, just to further illustrate the point, the problem with pixels, you can see here that you've got the effects, I guess you could say, of scaling based on pixel density. And it's something to keep in mind. Think about if you do have specific devices, what those densities are. But on the web, it's a little bit more interesting, shall we say. Orientation, that's one of the key factors that changes, especially for the native environments. But obviously, that applies to the web. But web has, again, more potential issues because of the proliferation of screens that it can be run on. But if you're dealing with a native platform, I guess, now to think about it, it's true more so maybe for Androids than it is for iOS in terms of the potential for varying screen layout issues even on native. But anyway, so orientation is one thing to keep in mind. It can change some things pretty significantly. The example here you see is showing the impact of the on-screen keyboard on this particular device, and you can see it takes up a whole lot more. And that actually is something that you tend not to think about if you're not used to designing for mobile, that these touch screen keyboards will take over a lot, and it can get a little bit wonky if you don't take that into account with stuff being off the screen. I'm sure you've probably experienced that a few times in your use of mobile apps, where you're typing and it's actually under the keyboard or something, and then you're trying to move the screen, and and then it wants to recenter. It gets a little annoying. So you definitely want to take that aspect into consideration, as well as just the general change in dimensions. Just another example here. This particular sample app that we did in Infragistics, we actually did a different view. So this is a little less common, I would say, but it's not unheard of, and it's certainly not a no-no in my book. But you can see that there's a different layout here. You can even do a different chart if you wanted to. In our case, we actually hid the top part of it and spread out the chart so that you can see more. You can do interesting variations on that theme as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that location was kind of the obvious one that everyone thinks about. And here are some of the other device capabilities that you might want to hook into. And it depends on your targets and things like that, and what you can get access to based on the platform that it's running on. But I do want to kind of provide a little bit of a caveat and warning here. Don't get crazy. I mean, the interesting thing about Android, I'll mention, is they have such openness that people can come up with all sorts of interesting variations on theme, like tilt to scroll and things like that. in the eye tracking, and it's just a little wonky, and at least in my experience in trying to use those and other people I've talked to, it's like you think it's going to be cool, but then it doesn't really work. So I would not go into it thinking that you're going to do something like that, unless that's like core or critical. I would definitely deprioritize doing stuff like that. Now, mapping in general is a pretty interesting thing to take advantage of, and it really depends. You have to think about if it adds value to your particular situation, in your context, in your domain. A lot of people think it's hard. There's plenty of tools like Infragistics tools out there that have really rich mapping capabilities, and they make it relatively easy for you to add rich mapping information into your apps. So you can do things like overlay charts and other kinds of information on top of maps. In addition to kind of like the bare bones out of the box stuff that you can get with like a Google mapping widget. So be thinking about those sorts of things. Proximity, ambient light. I mean, these tend to be more specialized. I think of this list, probably the most commonly used one would be the push notifications. Another common one that is kind of merged in with some of the other ones is the ability to take audio and or video or picture, I guess would be the more common case. If your app can take advantage of that and benefit from that, it's pretty slick, to be able to do that. And you all probably have had the experience of, for instance, depositing a check, with your mobile phone. I mean, I think that's one of the coolest and rather straightforwardest advances that the mobile banking has made in recent years. I certainly use it a lot and find it useful. So, if you're doing an expense app or something like that, it's definitely an obvious win to be able to leverage that. Or maybe your platform offers like voice to text. So that's again another way to make people safer when they're using their mobile devices, but also maybe just to help them out. Like for instance, my mom, she has not the best eyesight, so for her, using these small devices, she actually uses the dictation stuff quite a lot, more than most people I expect, and it's a very useful thing to have. So if your app, if you can take advantage of that, I mean, maybe your platform has it built in, but if you can work that in, that can be definitely useful. Now, push notifications, again, they can be very useful. They can also be very annoying, so you kind of have to make sure you're only using them for useful information. Don't use it just because you can. And if you're using a platform that supports it, you can definitely push stuff to the tile, or I'm trying to think of icon, I guess would be the word, to do like a badge, say on iOS, or you can do the live tile on Windows, things like that. Android, of course, has the also has the, I forget what they call them off the top of my head, but the widgets, I think they might be called, that you can do and actually embed into people's screens. And you can do all kinds of interesting stuff there in terms of sending information. So that's a lot we covered so far, but the question might be boiling in your head. Well, yeah, it sounds like basically I have to start over. And to an extent you need to think about that because of the whole concept of mobile first, in terms of re-examining what's actually really important versus what's ancillary, and how you surface that in your navigation and things like that. But here's some obvious things that you can adapt without a lot of rethinking. I mean, the core activities, if you have those primary activities and you do identify them, there's probably a chance at least that you can reuse some of that. If nothing else, you can reuse your logic, your services, your models. Maybe, if it depends on the state of your desktop UI, but maybe if it's a web UI and it's kind of contained enough, you could try to get it to reflow in a responsive manner. That's really going to depend on your particular circumstances, because it can get hairy really quickly if you try to do that. Now, controls, that's for us, we do a lot of controls, and a lot of them actually do work fairly well because they're not They don't really require the desktop size. You know, we're just a piece of your UI. It's not true for all of them, like our big fancy pants grids that we do that have so much amazing functionality and people find really useful. Those are a little bit more of a challenge, and believe me, we've worked on that problem to adapt those to mobile devices, and you end up, you know, having defined, for instance, different column layouts depending on widths and things like that, so that you can have a responsive kind of adaptive interface using something like a data-bound grid like we have. So it depends, but you know, think about that. Maybe there are some controls that will just port over real nice and you can reuse those. So I just wanted to drill in a little bit more on the kinds of things and to think about as you're adapting. First and most obvious excuse me, is form factor adaptation. I've already probably beat this drum a little bit, but reduce is key. Reduce, reduce, reduce. Eliminate stuff. Be really, really tough about that. I mean, you need to work with the people who define your requirements, essentially, and help them to understand this stuff. I mean, it's definitely not a matter of just squishing it in. So you have to kind of reduce and re-examine what actually is really important, and at least start from there. I mean, you can think about, like, maybe later we'll add in other stuff, or maybe you can split things into different apps. I mean, that's another kind of interesting approach for these devices, especially on, say, Windows platform, where you can use your live tiles, and if you had a tile for different concerns, you know, in your enterprise apps that would launch into those areas, you can actually segment the functionality across apps instead of trying to do that all in one app with, you know, lots of menus and things like that. And the benefit there would be that you could also kind of create a dashboard actually on the actual start menu, so you can see that high-level information and let people drill in from there. So it's an interesting pattern to think about. It's kind of a hub and spoke pattern. And then, of course, there's the fluidity aspect. I'll talk a little bit more about that next. And touch, obviously, events, especially the hover. There's other things you can do there. You can lay out if that information is important. And again, this is back to the reduce. Like, if you've got something that only shows on hover, is it really that important? You kind of have to ask yourself that. If it is that important, maybe it shouldn't be in hover. Maybe you should relay out that part of your UI so that you can supply that information. Or maybe it can be under like a little plus so that you can expand and show, you know, extra information. That's a key thing. If you are relying on hover, that's a key way to adapt, is to maybe have like a sort of a more or a plus or an I as in the letter I, you know, for info, so that you prompt people, because they can't hover, to know that there's possibly more information to get. There's the drill in, you know, on iOS often they'll have that little right arrow to get more information about things in a list. So, you know, you have to think about those and do those as appropriate. And of course the touch target. And don't forget, you need to optimize, especially for web, because it does, you know, on every loading, I guess you might say, of the app, it will send down, you know, the UI, potentially every page, depending on how you've designed it, which you need to rethink, as I mentioned before. And then the data itself. Sometimes it's easy to think, I'll just load in everything that they could possibly want and select from that. Again, you have to think about the balance between the number of requests versus the amount of stuff in one request. And maybe your initial load is just the minimum to show that first bit of information, and then the next one, or maybe in the background, you can go ahead and download more information. But also don't forget that people pay for bandwidth still in most parts of the world, so you don't want to be just sucking up unnecessary bandwidth, especially over cellular. And and even in some areas, you know, it's metered on land length. So keep that in mind. Responsive web design. So anyone who's familiar with trends in the last several years will have heard this term in the web areas. It's sounds really fancy, but it's really just kind of a straightforward concept, and it's an extension of the fluid layout pattern. So it uses a particular technique. In fact, it's less really about design so much, you know, because the design pattern is just fluid layout. You know, you adapt based on the container that you're in. But the specific sauce that's in responsive web design is this concept of using CSS media queries to adapt your layout and your styling, things like that. So basically anything that you can do with CSS, this technique would work with that. Most queries for these media queries, the most common ones are these breakpoints, and don't blame me, I did not choose that term. It's overloaded for those who are developers, but it's kind of a syntactical term, you might say, because you're just saying once it gets to this, you know, variable, whatever that variable is, you have a new set of styles that you're going to apply. Mostly that's based on widths. I mean, by far, that's like the #1 thing that people create breakpoints for. But, you know, another fairly common one is pixel density. Now, there's a new picture element. In fact, I think I just read today that the What working group is adding picture to their official specifications. So what that does, among other things, is enable you to supply different sources based on these common kinds of breakpoints like pixel density. So you can load in a higher pixel density image for the kinds of devices that have those, and of course that means more bandwidth, etc. But you know, you want that quality probably instead of having a blurry image. Whereas on the devices that don't have that, you can have the lower pixel density. And then also there's the, you know, I'm on a desktop, which is probably connected to a decent, you know, pipe in terms of the bandwidth. So maybe it's okay to have a nice, huge, beautiful, full bleed image on your page. But then on the phone, you know, if you try to just switch using conventional CSS media queries, it will still load that big image even if you specify some other image in that breakpoint. So that's the problem that the picture element is being designed to solve, is so that you don't have this issue of you're still loading in the huge image even though you're not even using it on particular devices, and you don't have to worry about, you know, using sprites to select the smaller part of a larger image and things like that, if that was something you were doing. Although sprites by far are still a good technique to use in terms of minimizing the number of requests. I don't want to give the wrong impression there. I'm just talking about big images that you might have previously just selected some to show, like through cropping, as opposed to you know, using a smaller image or something like that. Now, I think I touched on this before, but it's, you know, early on in the trends here for responsive web design, it's very common, and even today, because it's easy to think about, quite honestly, you'll see breakpoints like tablet and phone, and in some ways those are okay because those are definitely the most common kinds of devices, or classes, if you will. But the challenge there is that if you're thinking about specific pixels, like what does that actually map to, it's pretty fluid. And then you also have like portrait layout versus, what's the other one? Landscape, sorry. Layout. So if you're dealing with those kinds of ways of thinking about it and creating your breakpoints based on that, you're still going to have to kind of pick and think about, like, okay, this is for an iPad, and you'll just go crazy, especially on Android when you start looking at like the ridiculous number of sizes and stuff that they have. It just doesn't work if you're really trying to address that particular problem. So the solution is to find your natural breakpoints in the content. Now that may not sound sensical initially, but let me try to explain it with my hand waving, since I, you know, can't like draw it really. But basically the idea is that your content itself, let's say you start with well, you could start with either a mobile or a tablet or whatever you think your primary target is. I'm not super like, you know, you have to always start from phone kind of thing, because maybe phone isn't even like something you want people or expect them to use it on, and maybe you have no intention of supporting that. In my opinion, you know, that's fine if that's your environment. If you're totally open on the web, that's not a safe assumption. But if you're doing like an enterprise app and you know that everyone who's going to be hitting this is using a company-issued iPad or Android or something like that, it's totally fine, in my opinion, to go ahead and say, yeah, we're going to start with that particular form factor or class of device, and then you can optionally add scaling up or down from there. Now, I mention that because whatever you start with, you are going to get to a point, like let's say you're looking in your web browser and you just start resizing it. Either you're making it smaller, you're making it bigger. You're going to start seeing, like, once it gets to a certain point, it freaks out and it doesn't look right and it looks broken. That's your natural breakpoint. That's where you go, okay, obviously right here we need to change the layout, or we need to change the font size, or use a different image size, or whatever. That's where this approach really is targeted at. You need to look for those and just define them based on that. Don't even worry about the fact that it may be on a tablet in portrait mode versus landscape, or it may be on desktop that has been shrunk down because they only wanted to use half their screen. Who knows? The point is that if you're doing it based on content, you're going to hit all the important cases without having to worry about the fact that it may be viewed on 300 different actual devices. So it's a much better way to do it, and I highly recommend it, especially if you don't mandate essentially what devices your content is viewed on. Now, the last point here, and I don't know if you can see it very well in the background, but that one ring has sort of started to bleed through again here, and that's because that's what responsive web design is to some extent. It's back to this idea of, hey, I just want to create it once and have it magically run everywhere. Unfortunately, as we said at the beginning, and as you probably well know, that is a pipe dream. It's not going to work, even with responsive web design. The place that this particular technique was born out of was more out of those people who mostly do like content-oriented websites, where you're mostly dealing with text and images and just sort of breaking down how those flow a little differently. And probably the most complex thing that they have to deal with is changing the menu structure. And then of course you get into things like the thing like on Facebook, for instance, where they came up with where it slides over and you tap the hamburger icon, the little 3 lines. That's great and fine, but you know, that level of complexity, it's manageable and it's doable with responsive web design. Even that can get a little hairy depending on the number of page templates you have and the different kinds of content, and images and things like that. But if you have a more complex line of business application that has more complex controls, it starts getting hairy pretty quick. So you really have to do an analysis of, like, is this actually worth it? You know, are the layouts and the interactions similar enough that, you know, you can take an approach like this where you have one app that literally adapts. There are people out there, and some of them I very much respect because they've done a lot of work in the web world. They're huge advocates of responsive web design, and it's like, it is the one ring. I mean, it solves all things, and of course then they get into it and they'll talk about all the problems with it, and of course there are ways to address those problems, but ultimately you're just shifting where your complexity is. You can't get away from the complexity, the fact that it exists. So it kind of does boil down to the way I look at it, and I've written a couple blog posts about it, which I will try to supply in the notes. You kind of can start thinking about it in terms of classes, especially from a prototyping point of view, and like when you're trying to figure out the right thing. You can start from that idea of, we're just going to figure out what works best with someone who's using a tablet in whatever your target contexts are. You know they're going to be used outside of those, but at least you have like a goal and a target. and you create the optimal design for that. And then if you do want to target phone, you do the same thing. You create an optimized version for a phone interface. And then maybe, who knows, Google Apps, whatever your targets are, whatever classes of devices that you're thinking about. Maybe it's a TV. Probably at some point you're going to have desktop/laptop on there. You do what makes the most sense from a user interaction point of view, and then after you've done that work from a design perspective, then you go, okay, are these similar enough that we can manage having one app that serves all of them? I mean, that's the ideal way to approach it, in my opinion. You can just start from assuming responsive web design. I think that's kind of suboptimal, but maybe you already know you don't have the design time, you don't have the design resources, and you just need to get something out quick. Hey, this is a good if you're going to start from some basic approach, by all means start from responsive web design if that's kind of your situation that you find yourself in. But just know going into it that it's not going to be simple, and you're going to have things that are challenging, and you're probably going to end up having to do some blend of responsive and what they call adaptive. And the difference there is that you have to augment the CSS media query approach with some amount of detection, maybe on the server side, and serving up, for instance, maybe different images or different different shells, for instance, if you wanted to have a totally different navigation shell, or maybe you're trying to target a different look and feel. So, caveat, you've been warned, responsive web design is very useful, especially in simpler contexts, especially when it's similar enough, but that's something you have to figure out. Now, briefly wanted to mention here this case study that we did. We had customers come in, as we do every once in a while, for a little summit, and the problem we gave them here was, hey, here's this desktop app, and it was a stereotypical line of business thing, where you have your two-pane navigation, and there's a detailed view, and you dig into maybe even a hierarchical grid, for instance. How would you take this and adapt it to a mobile phone? I think that's the target that we started from. And interestingly enough, and I don't mean this disparagingly at all, but even though they were developers and not designers, they were architects, most of our customers are, they immediately did the right thing, in my opinion. They went to optimizing it for that particular target, and this is what I was just talking about. They didn't start from how can I squish this hierarchical grid into a phone. They said, how can I reimagine this that makes sense for a phone? And that, again, is the better way to do it. It doesn't mean it's always the most practical way to do it, but if you can take that approach, it's probably going to get you to a better end. And just wanted to illustrate that we all kind of know this, I think, to an extent intuitively, that it's not the right thing, but sometimes we're quick to make compromises because it's easier as developers. It's less. We think it's going to be less work or whatever. It's just you're kind of asking for trouble if you take the approach of squishing things in, because you're probably not going to make your users happy, and you probably have to do something new in the end, or maybe you'll have more bugs because of that. Who knows? There's all kinds of consequences. So I hope I've sufficiently scared you away from doing that. But anyways, if you want to think about reuse, you got to think about it in the terms of context. And this goes back to some extent that classes of devices, because those are part of the context. Whether or not they're moving about freely versus sitting in an office, things like that. The lines of reuse are going to be along those lines from a user's perspective. And if you start from there, you're going to win better than if you start from, hey, how can I reuse this technology that I already have? And just reiterating some of that. And I say at the end, don't forget about it. Forget about this write once, run everywhere. It is largely a pipe dream. I mean, there are some contexts where you can kind of get away with that, but it's not the ideal way to do it. Mobile first is a thing that this guy, I mentioned him earlier, Luke Robluski, came up with years ago, and it's a good approach, especially if you know you're going to have to start with phone, because the phone imposes the most restrictions on you from all these different aspects that we've talked about. So if you are going to tackle this problem, again, reimagine, starting from mobile first, and then you can expand out from there. But also, as I mentioned before, mobile first doesn't necessarily mean phone. I mean, it could be a tablet if that's what your target is. So do what's right, for you. Thank you again for listening to this talk. I will supply the information that I mentioned, a couple links and stuff that aren't in this particular deck. And you can always reach out to me. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can get to me through the Infragistics.com website if you want to do that. I'm also Ambrose at Infragistics.com, so it's kind of a tricky thing there. The trickiest part being Infragistics as kind of a long word to write in, but anyways, hopefully you can remember that if you do want to email me. And have a great day, and hope you found this useful. Thanks.